Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, standing right in the middle of a super busy modern city intersection.
Right, like rush hour.
Exactly. The light turns green, you've got city buses accelerating, a delivery truck is honking at someone, commuters are just, clutching their coffees and rushing toward this massive $170 million Marriott hotel.
Yeah, the whole convention center vibe.
Right. And sitting there, right in the absolute dead center of all this 21st century asphalt and noise, is a towering 43-foot granite sentinel from 1874.
That's wild.
It really is. I mean, you don't have to walk into some quiet, climate-controlled museum to see this thing. It is literally standing directly in the line of traffic.
Yeah, which is kind of the literal definition of history colliding with the morning commute. I mean, we're so used to encountering the past behind thick glass, right?
Yeah, with the little white placard explaining what you're looking at.
Exactly. But when you step into the world of urban public memory, that glass case just completely shatters.
Well, okay, let's unpack this, because that is exactly what we are doing today. We're taking this whole stack of local historical documents, newspaper archives spanning over a century, and some really detailed sesquicentennial reflections written in 2024.
Some really great sources in there.
Yeah, amazing stuff. And we're using all of it to explore the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So the mission for this deep dive is to figure out how a single carved stone pillar manages to tell the sweeping story of American grief, the mechanical evolution of a city, and, just the incredibly complex nature of community memory.
Which I have to say is just an essential exercise. Because monuments often suffer from this kind of, like an invisibility.
What do you mean by invisibility? Like people just ignore them?
Yeah, pretty much. When you drive past something every single day, it just becomes part of the background geometry of your life.
Right, like turn left at the big statue.
Exactly. You use it as a landmark to tell a friend where to turn, but you stop actually seeing it. But the Lancaster Monument is, frankly, a masterclass in how physical structures don't just sit there. They actively absorb and reflect the changing values, the politics, and quite literally the physical impact of the generations that inherit them.
Okay, so let's set the scene for everyone listening. Picture downtown Lancaster, Penn Square. Historically and practically, this is the very heart of the city.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got the historic Central Market right nearby, which is one of the oldest continuously operating farmers markets in the country, I think.
Yep. Right.
And then you have the modern convention center. It's a massive hub of commerce. And rising right out of the brick and pavement is this Gothic revival monument. But to understand how it survived a century and a half of relentless urban change, we kind of have to start by looking at the anatomy of the thing itself.
We do, because what's fascinating here is that every single inch of this structure was deliberately engineered, like to broadcast a very specific message to anyone walking by.
Yeah.
Literally nothing about it is accidental.
Okay, let's start with the sheer scale of it then. It stands 43 feet tall.
Massive.
Yeah. That's roughly the height of a 4-story building, just dropped into the middle of a public square. And it's entirely constructed from fine-grained Rhode Island granite.
Which is a crucial detail.
Right, because it immediately makes you wonder about the mechanics of just building the thing. I mean, getting 43 feet of solid granite from a quarry in Rhode Island all the way down to a landlocked county in Pennsylvania in the early 1870s, that is a staggering logistical feat.
It really is. I think we take heavy freight for granted today, with semis and interstate highways. But in the post-Civil War era, moving massive blocks of dense stone required this incredibly complex network of steam-powered rail lines.
Right.
And specialized flatbed cars and, honestly, just teams and teams of draft horses.
Just to move rocks.
Well, very specific rocks. They chose Rhode Island granite, specifically because of its fine-grained structure. Granite is an igneous rock, right? Formed from cooling magma.
Okay.
And a fine-grained variety means the quartz and feldspar crystals in it are very, very small and tightly packed together.
So super dense.
Super dense, yeah. Which gives the stone incredible durability. It has to survive centuries of harsh northeast winters. But crucially, that tight grain allows a stonecutter to carve incredibly crisp, sharp details without the rock just, shattering or flaking apart.
And they absolutely needed that level of detail because when you look closely, this monument is just covered in text and symbolism. Like you look at the center pillar, the main shaft that sort of draws your eye upward, you see the names of 8 specific Civil War battles carved directly into the stone.
Yeah, that's a very heavy element.
It is. We're looking at Antietam, Chaplin Hills, Chickamauga, Gettysburg, Malvern Hill, Petersburg, Vicksburg, and the Wilderness.
And the inclusion of those specific battles is such sobering piece of documentary evidence. Well, think about the people in 1874. The locals walking past this monument weren't reading a history book. They were reading a list of the exact places where their brothers, their husbands, their sons had their bodies torn apart.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
These were sites of immense, catastrophic bloodshed for the specific regiments that hailed from Lancaster. Carving them into granite was a way of permanently fixing those distant, bloody fields right into the local geography.
That really grounds it. And then, moving down from that central pillar to the base, you find 4 distinct figures standing guard. These are 6-foot-tall statues of men positioned at the 4 corners of the monument.
Representing the military branches.
Exactly. The 4 branches of the United States military as they were organized at the time of the Civil War. So you have the infantry of the Army, the Navy, the cavalry, and the artillery.
And each figure is meticulously detailed. They've got the appropriate uniforms, the correct accoutrements of their specific branch. They function as these earthly guardians of the memorial.
Kind of standing watch.
Precisely. They represent the living, breathing men of Lancaster who marched off to fight.
Yeah.
But the architectural style of the monument as a whole, that Gothic revival structure you mentioned, it's designed to force your perspective upward.
Because Gothic is all about height, right?
Yes, it's all about verticality, pointing toward the heavens. So it deliberately pulls your eye past the earthly soldiers, past the battlefields, all the way up to the very pinnacle.
And what stands at the absolute top is really striking. It's an 8-foot-tall statue of a woman, officially titled The Genius of Liberty.
Yeah, The Genius of Liberty is a fascinating study in 19th century allegorical art. She's draped in this flowing classical garb.
Looking very Greek or Roman.
Exactly. And that was a highly deliberate choice. It was meant to connect the American experiment to the perceived nobility, the democracy, and the timelessness of ancient Greece and the Roman Republic.
Trying to make it mythic.
Right. It elevated the terrible, messy reality of the Civil War into this mythic, heroic struggle for classical ideals.
So, she's wearing a crown made of twisted rope adorned with 5 stars. She holds a shield in one hand, and in her right hand she holds a sword. But here's the detail I found most interesting. The sword is drawn, but it's pointing directly downward toward the earth.
Oh, yeah. The orientation of that sword is perhaps the single most important symbolic gesture on the entire monument.
Really? More than the soldiers?
Absolutely, because a raised sword indicates a charge, right? It means an ongoing battle or a call to aggression. But a downward pointing sword is an ancient symbol indicating the cessation of hostilities.
So saying the war is over.
Yes. It means the bitter conflict has concluded. It's a posture of victory, sure, but primarily it's a posture of rest. The Union was preserved, and the sword could finally be lowered.
That's incredibly powerful. And the direction she's facing also tells a very specific story about the political climate of the era. Because for 150 years, the legend in Lancaster has been that the Genius of Liberty deliberately faces dead north.
Right.
Like actively turning her back on the defeated southern states.
Which makes perfect sense when you analyze it. When looking at a monument from 1874, we have to view its construction through the lens of the people who actually built it.
They were pretty angry.
Very angry. A community in a northern state, just years removed from a brutal conflict that decimated their male population.
Yeah.
They were not feeling particularly conciliatory, you know.
No, I imagine not.
So facing the statue north, away from the states that had attempted to secede, was a physical manifestation of strong unionist sentiment. It reflected the moral and political worldview of a victorious, grieving North. The monument wasn't just a grave marker.
It was a statement.
Exactly. It was a permanent assertion of their ideological stance.
It's honestly exactly like opening up an antique 19th century Swiss watch. you know?
I like that analogy.
Yeah, you open the back and you don't just see a dial. You see hundreds of tiny gears, springs, and jewels, and every single one of them was engineered to perform a highly specific function. The fine-grained granite, the downward sword, the orientation toward the north, the specific battles chosen, none of it is just decorative. It's this highly engineered machine designed to transmit a very clear emotional and political frequency to whoever looks at it.
A machine for memory. That captures it perfectly.
Okay, so we have a clear picture of what this sentinel looks like. But before we get into how a local community actually managed to pay for and build a massive stone watch in the 1870s, we have to talk about exactly where they decided to put it.
Ah, yes. Penn Square.
Right, because you don't just drop 43 feet of granite randomly anywhere. They placed it dead center in Penn Square. And looking at the sources, that exact patch of dirt was already carrying an unbelievable amount of historical weight, like long before the first shot of the Civil War was ever fired.
The geography of memory is often so layered. And what's fascinating here is that the monument sits precisely on the footprint of the old Lancaster courthouse, which was constructed way back in 1739.
A courthouse built decades before the United States even existed. And the events that took place inside it are monumental. In 1744, this very spot hosted the signing of the Treaty of Lancaster.
Which I should note was a massive geopolitical event in colonial America. It wasn't some minor local agreement.
Right. It involved a lot of players.
It did. It was a complex negotiation between the British colonial governments of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, and the representatives of the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee.
Wow.
Yeah, these negotiations took weeks. They involved land cessions, complex trade agreements, and shifting alliances that would essentially shape the expansion of the American colonies and lead into the French and Indian War. The center of Penn Square was literally the epicenter of 18th century diplomacy.
And the historical gravity of the spot just compounds from there. Move forward a bit to the American Revolution. The date is September 27, 1777.
A very bad time for the colonial army.
Very bad. The Second Continental Congress is essentially on the run. The British Army had just seized Philadelphia. The founders of the country are fleeing westward to avoid capture, and they arrive in Lancaster.
Seeking a safe haven.
Yeah, and they hold a session in that exact same courthouse on Penn Square.
It was a moment of profound crisis for the young nation. And for that single day, the center of the American government, the very heart of the rebellion against the British crown, was located on this patch of dirt in Lancaster.
Just for one day, right?
Right. They quickly realized they needed to put a wider physical barrier between themselves and the British forces, so they packed up and moved across the Susquehanna River to York, Pennsylvania. But that doesn't erase the fact that for a day, Lancaster was the capital of the United States.
Now, the original courthouse eventually burned down, was rebuilt, and then was completely removed from the square by the 1850s to make room for traffic and commerce.
Progress, as they called it.
Right. But the significance of the ground obviously remained. In fact, decades after the Civil War monument was built, in 1896, they added an inscription near the bottom base, specifically noting that the Continental Congress met there.
They felt compelled to physically mark the older history, right alongside the newer history.
But hold on, though. This is where I have to question the logic of the 19th century city planners.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you know that a specific square of ground is the site of a major colonial Native American treaty, and you know it served as the capital of the country during the Revolutionary War, doesn't plunking a 43-foot Gothic Civil War tower right on top of it essentially bulldoze that older history?
That's a fair question.
Doesn't the sheer physical mass of the 1874 monument just overwrite the invisible history of 1744 and 1777? I mean, does the monument overshadow the ground it sits on?
It's a totally valid critique, and it really speaks to how different generations prioritize their own historical narratives.
Yeah.
But, and this is key in the context of 19th century monument building, placing a new structure on an old historic site wasn't usually seen as erasure.
No,
it was seen as a deliberate transfer of legitimacy.
a transfer of legitimacy. How so?
Okay, so the people erecting the Soldiers and Sailors Monument were dealing with the immediate, visceral trauma of the Civil War. They wanted to elevate the sacrifice of their local men to the highest possible level.
Okay.
So by anchoring their Civil War memorial directly into the bedrock of a Revolutionary War site, they were establishing a pedigree for their grief.
Oh, wow. I see.
Yeah, they were making a physical, geographical argument that the Union preserved in 1865 was the exact same sacred union forged on that spot in 1777. The soldiers of the Civil War were being positioned as the direct inheritors and defenders of the Founding Fathers.
Okay, that shifts the perspective entirely. They weren't trying to bury the Continental Congress. They were trying to borrow its halo.
Precisely.
It's a way of saying our tragedy belongs in the same chapter as the birth of the nation. Okay, so the location is secured. The design is heavy with symbolism. But the practical reality of erecting a structure this massive in the late 19th century, I mean, that's just daunting. Extremely daunting. The final bill for the monument was $26,000 in the 1870s. That is an astronomical sum of money for a local municipality. How does a grieving post-war community actually pull off a crowdfunding effort of that magnitude?
Well, to understand the drive behind the fundraising, you really have to look at the sheer scale of the demographic loss. The sources emphasize that over 12,000 men from Lancaster County served in the Union Army.
12,000 men from a single county.
Correct. And roughly 10% of them, about 1,200 men, died while in service.
That's just a staggering number for a local community.
Think about what that actually means for the social and economic fabric of a town. That is 1,200 empty chairs at dinner tables, missing hands on the local farms, lost tradesmen in the city. The psychological toll was just pervasive.
So they needed an outlet.
It's exactly. In response to this void, organizations formed to care for veterans and honor the dead, particularly the Grand Army of the Republic, which functioned as this massive political and social fraternal organization for Union veterans. And locally, this energy coalesced into the Soldiers and Sailors Union of Lancaster.
But passion and grief don't automatically print banknotes. Someone had to actually organize the capital. And according to the historical records, the tip of the spear for this massive financial undertaking wasn't the politicians or the generals.
No, it wasn't.
It was a women's civic organization called the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster, led by a woman named Rosina Hubley.
We really have to highlight this. The role of women's civic organizations in post-Civil War memorialization cannot be overstated. While men were often returning to the workforce or diving into politics, women who had spent the war organizing relief, rolling bandages, and managing the home front, they pivoted their considerable organizational skills toward mourning and memory.
And Rosina Hubley clearly knew what she was doing.
She was a formidable organizer. In December of 1867, just a couple of years after the guns fell silent, the Patriot Daughters launched a massive week-long fundraising fair.
Right. They held it at Fulton Hall, which locals today know as the historic Fulton Theater. Imagine a week-long 19th century bazaar with the entire community coming out to buy goods, attend dinners, and donate. The records are incredibly precise on this. They raised exactly $3,620.53.
Which is a testament to their hard work. I mean, raising over $3,600 at a local fair in 1867 is a massive achievement.
Huge.
But their stated goal was $20,000. So they had laid a really strong foundation, but they had hit a ceiling. The project had essentially stalled.
It's the classic crowdfunding dilemma. You have a charismatic leader, you have a passionate core audience, you have a successful launch event that brings in the seed money, but then you hit the doldrums. You need serious institutional backing to actually manufacture the product.
Right, the stretch goals.
Yeah. And that is where the local government stepped in with a remarkably creative accounting solution.
It was a very practical intervention. In February 1871, the state granted an official charter to the Lancaster County Monumental Association, basically creating a legal entity to manage the project. And to close that massive funding gap, the county commissioners authorized the use of a very specific pool of municipal funds.
Right. They contributed $5,187.43.
Yes, but this money didn't come from a general property tax.
This is the best part.
It really is. It was pulled from collected military taxes and, quite ingeniously, from misdemeanor fines levied against members of the local militia.
That detail is just brilliant to me. If you were a local militia member in the years after the war and you showed up late to drill or your uniform was out of regulation, your disciplinary fine went directly into the fund for the monument.
Yep.
The city literally used the minor infractions of the living military to build a towering tribute to the fallen military. I just think that's an incredibly poetic way to bridge the funding gap.
It was very smart. So, with the funds secured, eventually swelling to that final cost of $26,000, they could finally begin construction. They approved a design by Lewis Haldy, who was a local Lancaster stonecutter and, importantly, a Civil War veteran himself.
Nice local connection.
Yeah. But the actual fabrication of the monument was contracted out to Batterson Canfield and Company based in Hartford, Connecticut. They were essentially the premier manufacturer of large-scale Civil War monuments in the country at that time.
So the design is approved, the Rhode Island granite is carved up in Connecticut, and work begins in Lancaster in the spring of 1873. They start excavating the dead center of Penn Square to pour the foundation. And this is where they run into a major mid-19th century engineering crisis.
A huge roadblock.
Yeah. As they dig down, they discover an active system of city water pipes running directly underneath the proposed site.
Now, modern construction would view this as a minor annoyance, right? Today, you would simply reroute the pipes, or encase them, and pour a massive slab of reinforced steel and concrete over the top to support the weight. But reinforced concrete wasn't a standard building practice in 1873.
Right. And they are dealing with tens of thousands of pounds of solid stone. If you just set that directly on top of delicate 19th century water pipes, the sheer weight will completely crush the city's infrastructure.
It would have been a disaster.
So what is the mechanical solution? The sources, particularly this historical paper presented by James McMahon in 1961, they detail exactly how they solved it. Instead of moving the pipes, they essentially built a bridge over them. They designed the massive base of the monument to be completely hollow.
Which is just a remarkable piece of masonry engineering. They rested the entire 43-foot structure on 4 stone abutments, each about 9 feet long.
Acting like the legs of a giant, incredibly heavy table.
Exactly. They boxed in the pipes to protect them, and the arches of the base straddled the infrastructure perfectly. The engineering was so precise that a municipal water worker could literally crawl underneath the base of the monument into the dark, hollow center and use a wrench to patch a leaky pipe without disturbing the stone above.
It's such a vivid image. You have this towering, solemn expression of national grief reaching into the sky, and directly underneath it, integrated into its very foundation, is the mundane, vital plumbing of a growing city.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it underscores how a monument in a public square isn't separate from the city. It has to physically negotiate with the city's living systems just to exist. And this actually ties directly back to what the founders of the project intended.
Oh, about the placement.
Yeah. We have a really powerful quote from Rosina Hubley about why she wanted this massive structure placed exactly where it was. She envisioned it as a perpetual reminder to all people of the country as they gather week to week to barter and chaffer in the marketplace that there is something higher and better than self or produce, bargains or banknotes.
Higher and better than self or produce. Wow. That is an incredibly pointed statement. She is drawing a direct contrast between the sacrifice of the soldiers and the everyday capitalism happening all around them.
She was highly aware of the context of Penn Square. It was the commercial artery of Lancaster. People came to the central market to make money, to trade, to buy food, to engage in the absolute self-interest of daily survival.
The hustle and bustle.
Right. Hubley didn't want the monument tucked away in some quiet contemplative cemetery. She wanted it dropped right into the middle of the noise and the greed. She wanted it to physically interrupt the commerce of the city, to force merchants and bankers to look up from their ledgers and acknowledge the bloody sacrifice that made their free market possible. It was designed to demand reverence.
That's fascinating. So the hollow base is laid over the pipes, the granite pieces are assembled, the 4 soldiers take their posts, and the genius of liberty is raised to the very top. The grand unveiling and dedication ceremony takes place on July 4th, 1874. And the historical accounts of that day paint a picture of an overwhelming civic and emotional spectacle.
The dedication of a major monument in the 1870s was a massive community event. Thousands of people packed into Penn Square and the radiating streets. You really have to imagine the scene. The surrounding brick buildings draped in red, white, and blue bunting, a massive turnout of Civil War veterans wearing their Grand Army of the Republic ribbon.
That's a sea of people.
A sea of people. And the monument itself, with the genius of liberty, completely veiled by a massive American flag, just waiting for the reveal.
And the organizing committee had actually sent an invitation to President Ulysses S. Grant to attend, which, given his history as the commanding general of the Union armies, would have been a massive coup. But Grant sent his regrets and was unable to travel to Lancaster.
Which was probably a disappointment.
Sure, but even without the president, the ceremony had a visceral, emotional center of gravity that no politician could ever provide. They arranged for a choir to perform, But it wasn't just any choir. They brought in a group of young girls from the Mountjoy Soldiers Orphan Home.
Oh, that is an incredibly potent decision.
Right.
It strips away any romanticized abstract notions of war and forces the crowd to look at the direct human consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These were children whose fathers were actively buried in the battlefields, carved onto the pillar right above them. And the song they were chosen to sing was titled My Father's Grave.
Wow.
Picture the scene. Hundreds of hardened combat veterans standing in the crowd, looking at the orphan daughters of the men who died right next to them, listening to them sing a dirge about their missing fathers. It honestly makes the hair on my arms stand up.
It really is moving.
It proves that this dedication wasn't a triumphant, jingoistic victory lap, It was a raw, open, and necessary release of communal grief.
It grounded the monument in the harsh reality of loss. And when the flag was finally pulled away in 1874, the monument had a very singular, focused identity. It was dedicated exclusively to the Civil War.
Right. There were no other plaques yet.
None. The primary inscription carved into the base is very specific, it reads. Erected by the people of Lancaster County, to the memory of their fellow citizens who fell in defense of the Union in the War of the Rebellion, 1861 to 1865.
But history doesn't stop. The years march forward. The veterans of the Civil War grow old, and the orphans grow up. The 20th century arrives, and with it comes an entirely new wave of global conflicts. And as the town sends new generations off to fight, they realize they have a localized problem.
Yes, they do.
They need a place to mourn these new losses, but the exact center of their town is already occupied by an 1874 monument.
And this is where we see the physical structure begin to adapt to the changing needs of the community. Monuments, particularly those in central civic spaces, rarely remain static.
The first major evolution of the monument's identity happened on June 8, 1931. The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War presented a new bronze tablet to the Lancaster Monumental Association. This tablet featured a bas-relief likeness of Abraham Lincoln and the full text of the Gettysburg Address.
Okay.
And they attached it to the base, deliberately placing it on the side facing west, pointing precisely in the geographical direction of the Gettysburg battlefield.
Now, that addition makes logical sense. It is a thematic expansion of the Civil War narrative. It reinforces the original intent while bringing Lincoln's defining words directly into the square. But the additions didn't stop with the Civil War.
No, they didn't. Over the following decades, a steady stream of bronze plaques was bolted onto the granite base. The community added a plaque to retroactively honor the soldiers of the American Revolution.
Going backwards first.
Right. Then they added one for the War of 1812. Then came a plaque for World War I. Then World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War. They also added a very specific plaque to commemorate the historical role of African Americans in the military.
What you are describing is a recognized phenomenon in the study of public memorials. Historians often refer to it as monumental mission creep.
Monumental mission creep. I love that term. It's like the monument became the town's expanding collective USB drive for all military memory. Every time there is new conflict, they just download a new plaque and bolt it onto the hardware.
That's a great analogy.
But so what does this all mean? I have to ask about the artistic integrity of that. When a town takes a highly specific Gothic revival structure built by widows and orphans in 1874 exclusively for the Civil War, and they start drilling holes in it to attach bronze plaques for jungle warfare in Vietnam or desert combat in the Persian Gulf, does that fundamentally ruin the original artistic intent?
Well, it absolutely alters the original artistic intent. The Patriot Daughters did not build a monument for the 1990s.
Right.
However, from a sociological standpoint, it's incredibly revealing. When a monument occupies the premier central space in a town, it becomes the de facto altar for all public mourning. The citizens of Lancaster in the mid-20th century couldn't just knock down the 1874 monument and build a new 43-foot tower for World War II and another one for Korea. The space was already taken.
So they have to share real estate.
Exactly. And the psychological benefit of sharing that real estate is profound. By physically attaching the plaques for the Vietnam War to the base of the Civil War monument, the modern community is doing exactly what the Civil War generation did when they built on top of the Continental Congress site.
Oh, they're borrowing the halo again.
Yes. They are validating the new grief by binding it to the established hallowed grief of the past. They are making a statement that the young men lost in the forests of Europe or the jungles of Vietnam are equal in honor and part of the exact same unbroken lineage of sacrifice as the men who fell at Gettysburg.
It's a way of ensuring the new veterans aren't forgotten by physically fusing their memory to a monument that the town has already agreed is sacred. It really is a living, evolving document. But while the meaning of the monument was expanding in the 20th century, the physical space it occupied was coming under severe threat.
A very literal threat.
Yeah. The enemy that nearly destroyed the Soldiers and Sailors Monument wasn't the British, and it wasn't the Confederacy. It was the invention of the internal combustion engine.
Ah, the battle for Penn Square. This is where the narrative shifts away from memory and grief and plunges directly into the aggressive world of mid-20th century urban planning.
To understand the conflict, we have to look at how much the environment around the monument changed. When it was dedicated in 1874, it was surrounded by dirt streets. It sat inside a massive 35-foot square enclosure protected by heavy stockade fencing. By 1877, they had upgraded that protection to an imposing iron fence and a solid granite wall.
So it had a big footprint.
Huge. It was a spacious, highly protected oasis meant for pedestrians and horse-drawn carriages.
But a city is a living organism, right? Mm-hmm. And its circulatory system was about to undergo a radical transformation. The dirt streets were paved over with cobblestones and eventually smooth asphalt. The slow, horse-drawn carriages were replaced by electric trolleys running on metal tracks.
And then the cars.
And then came the gas-powered buses and the absolute explosion of personal automobiles. By the 1920s, Penn Square wasn't just a market center. It was a major, highly congested traffic hub.
And you have this massive stone pillar sitting exactly where city planners desperately want to route cars and load buses. The friction was inevitable. The sources detail that starting in the 1920s and accelerating heavily into the post-World War II boom of the 1950s, there were serious, sustained, and highly organized campaigns by city officials to just dismantle the monument.
Tear it down.
Yeah. Pull it out of Penn Square entirely and relocate it to a city park.
And the arguments made by the city planners were incredibly pragmatic and typical of the mid-century mindset, which prioritized vehicular efficiency above almost all else.
They just wanted the cars to move.
Right. Their stance was simple. The monument is a massive traffic hazard. It is causing economic gridlock in the downtown core. If we dismantle it and rebuild it in a nice, green, quiet city park, people will actually be able to look at it safely without dodging a bus.
Makes sense on paper. But there was fierce resistance from the community. The sources we are working from include Sesquicentennial Reflections from 2024, written by the son of one of the men who stood on the front lines to defend the monument's location. His name was James McMahon.
Yes.
He was a veteran of the Marine Corps, a police officer for the city of Lancaster, and an intense and dedicated amateur historian.
James McMahon's involvement is a perfect example of how local history is often defended by passionate individuals. In April of 1961, McMahon went before the Lancaster County Historical Society and presented a meticulously researched paper simply titled History of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Lancaster.
Just laying out the facts.
Exactly. But it wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a tactical defense. He systematically laid out the true story of its creation, emphasizing its placement on the side of the Continental Congress to argue that its geographic location was absolutely non-negotiable.
He recognized that moving the stone meant severing its connection to the history of the ground.
Right.
But the fight didn't end in the 60s, though. In 1970, the push to relocate the monument surged again. This time, a retired history professor from Franklin and Marshall College, Frederick S. Klein, took up the mantle.
He took a very grassroots approach.
He did. He organized a massive campaign. He and his volunteers hit the streets and gathered 10,000 signatures from local citizens, demanding that the city leave the monument exactly where it was.
And 10,000 signatures in a local municipal dispute is an overwhelming display of political force. It demonstrated to the city council that moving the monument would be an electoral disaster. They were forced to abandon the relocation plan and find a compromise between the demands of historical memory and the demands of traffic flow.
And the compromise they hammered out in 1972 is fascinating from an architectural standpoint. To ease the congestion without moving the pillar, the city completely altered the traffic pattern of the square. They built a brick pedestrian plaza extending out from the nearby Fulton Bank, which closed off vehicular traffic on the northeast side, finally giving people a safe way to walk right up to the base.
That there was a cost.
A big one. To make the turning lanes work on the remaining sides, they had to cannibalize the monument's footprint.
They executed a radical physical alteration.
They literally removed the historic 1877 iron railings and the protective granite walls. They took the original expansive 35-foot base enclosure and shrank it down to just 17 and a half feet. They essentially sawed the monument's protective buffer in half.
They replaced that grand enclosure with a compact 12-inch high granite curb and an inclining wall, integrating modern lighting directly into the granite. It was the tight, streamlined base designed specifically to allow cars to corner around it more efficiently.
It's crazy.
And shortly after the surgical alteration, on April 6, 1973, the defenders of the monument secured a permanent victory. The monument was officially added to the National Register of Historic Places and designated a U.S. shrine.
Wow, a U.S. shrine.
Yes. And that federal designation meant that no federal highway or urban renewal funds could ever be used to destroy or relocate it. It was permanently anchored.
I understand the victory, but here's where it gets really interesting. Let's play devil's advocate for a second. We normally treat historical artifacts with a sense of absolute purity. We wear white gloves to handle old documents. But here, they literally hacked away half of the monument's historic footprint just to make room for bus tires.
Right.
If they had agreed to the 1950s plan and moved the entire structure fully intact, 35-foot base, and all to a beautiful leafy city park, wouldn't that have been better? Children could play around it. Veterans could sit on quiet benches and reflect on the plaques. Wouldn't a park be a more respectful, safer place to honor the dead than leaving it choked by exhaust fumes and honking horns?
This raises an important question, and it's the central debate of urban historic preservation. Do you prioritize pristine, sanitized preservation, or do you prioritize active, daily context?
Exactly. Why is the exhaust-choked square better than the quiet park?
Because moving it to a park would have fundamentally neutered its power. Think back to Rosina Hubley's vision. She wanted it to interrupt commerce. If you move a monument to a park, it becomes a destination. You only engage with it when you actively choose to go for a stroll or visit a memorial. It becomes an inert museum piece.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yes, but a town square is a mandatory space. By keeping it in the exact center of the city's traffic flow, even at the cost of shrinking its base, McMahon, Klein, and the 10,000 signatories ensured that history remained an unavoidable obstacle.
An unavoidable obstacle. I love that.
Yeah. When you have to tap your brakes, check your mirrors, and steer your vehicle around a 43-foot pillar of granite just to get to your office or the grocery store, you are physically interacting with the Civil War every single day. You cannot ignore the past when it is literally dictating the movement of your present.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The inconvenience is the point. But remaining an unavoidable obstacle in the center of a bustling 20th century intersection meant the monument didn't just passively witness modern history, it violently collided with it.
Yes, it did.
And that brings us to the physical scars of the city.
When a monument lives in the streets, it shares the fate of the streets. It is exposed to the elements, the politics, and the accidents of the population.
Over the decades, it has served as the ultimate civic backdrop for Lancaster. The archives note that when World War II finally ended in 1945, jubilant crowds naturally converged on Penn Square, celebrating the surrender right at the feet of the Genius of Liberty.
A very happy collision.
Right. And in 1960, during the presidential campaign, Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy came to Lancaster. He spoke in the square, drawing an enormous crowd estimated between 5,000 and 15,000 people, all swirling around the granite sentinel.
It was the focal point for the community's highest, most euphoric highs.
But sitting in the middle of a roadway also exposes it to the lowest lows, and to literal kinetic violence. Vehicles hit it.
Frequently.
On November 12, 1978, a deeply tragic incident occurred at the base of the monument. A local woman named Donna J. Yale committed suicide by intentionally accelerating her car and crashing it directly into the monument.
The impact was devastating. The sources note that the force of the collision was so severe that the vehicle actually exploded upon impact.
And the physical force of that crash didn't just damage the base, it directly struck the statue of the Navy sailor standing guard on that corner. The force of the explosion and the impact shattered the 6-foot solid granite figure into 6 distinct pieces.
Which is just awful on so many levels.
It is. The city had to undertake a massive restoration project. It took over a year and $25,000 to painstakingly piece the sailors' base and legs back together using industrial cement.
And unfortunately, the violence of the roadway wasn't an isolated incident.
No. Just a few years later, in March of 1985, a man named Richard Lugo lost control of his truck and crashed right into the monument, severely cracking several of the thick concrete slabs that make up the compromised base. That collision cost the city another $20,000 to repair.
Add to that the constant degradation from weather and automotive exhaust. The city has had to sandblast and scrub the monument multiple times. The records note major cleanings in 1905 and 1924. They have continually had to upgrade the lighting system embedded in the base, with major overhauls in 1956, 1972, and into the early 2000s.
It just takes a beating.
It does. It is not a static object. It is in a constant, expensive cycle of being damaged, dirtied, and repaired.
It functions exactly like a granite lighthouse in a sea of asphalt. It stands there taking the beating. It absorbs the actual physical impact of the modern world. It bears the soot of the buses, the cracks from the collisions, and the patched cement scars from the citizens who live, celebrate, and sometimes tragically end their lives against its foundation.
And that ultimately is what gives a structure like this its true, enduring value. A monument's worth isn't captured in that pristine, perfect moment of its 1874 unveiling when the stone was smooth and the bunting was clean. No, its real value is forged over 150 years of surviving the city. The cemented, repaired legs of the Navy sailor statue tell just as poignant a story about the complex, sometimes tragic realities of Lancaster in the late 20th century as the downward-pointing sword of the Genius of Liberty tells about the political climate of the 1870s. It is a composite, physical record of the city's entire lifespan.
The scars are the proof that it is still alive. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've taken a deep dive into a single geographic coordinate and watched it transform across centuries.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We started with the diplomatic complexities of a 1744 Iroquois treaty, moved to the frantic one-day capital of the fleeing Continental Congress, and then watched a grieving post-war community funnel their fair proceeds and militia fines into a hollow 43-foot granite sentinel.
Over top of water pipes, no less.
Right. And we saw that sentinel evolve from a specific memorial for orphan children into an expanding hard drive for all military memory, and finally into a traffic island that bears the literal patched scars of modern car crashes.
It perfectly illustrates how dynamic and volatile public history truly is.
Yeah.
And the takeaway here is to change how we interact with our own environments.
For everyone listener.
Exactly. The next time you are walking or driving through your local town square, take a moment to actually look at the monuments you pass every day. Stop treating them as invisible architecture. Look at the specific geography of where they are placed. Look at the mismatching bronze plaques that have been added over the decades.
Really look at them.
Look closely for the chips in the stone, the exhaust stains, the repair marks. They are not just sitting there. They are active, battered participants in your community's ongoing story, constantly being reinterpreted and physically altered by the world swirling around them.
Absolutely. Stop and really look at the stone. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over.
Okay.
The Lancaster Soldiers and Sailors Monument was a massive $26,000 physical undertaking. It required a network of trains to move tons of Rhode Island granite and intricate masonry to build a hollow base over fragile water pipes, just to ensure the community never forgot its grief.
It took an incredible physical effort.
Right. But look at our world today. Our modern collective memories, our global tragedies, our societal triumphs, our current wars, the immense losses of the recent pandemic, they are no longer being recorded in physical stone. They exist almost entirely in the digital cloud. They live in endless social media feeds, in viral videos, and in the transient data centers that power our phones.
That's a very striking contrast.
So here's the question. Will humanity ever organize to build physical 43-foot stone monoliths to our shared history again? Or is the era of carving our memory into granite, of building massive physical lighthouses to withstand the traffic of the future, officially behind us?
That is a profound question about the durability of modern memory. If we don't build in stone, what will be left to interrupt the traffic of the 22nd century?
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking closely at the streets around you, keep asking questions about the past, and, as always, keep learning.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.